Hey everybody, we are on Period 4, The Age of Reform, Part 1, Lesson 4.11.1. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how and why various reform movements developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848. If you didn't know, reform means attempts to make changes, usually for the better and usually in society. So if you reform something, you're looking to improve it. So to begin, let's rewind to the Second Great Awakening, which was this religious revival that happened in the 1800s, and it placed a greater emphasis on the importance of the individual in deciding their own fate. And that was prompted by the market revolution and the Jacksonian democracy, both of which empowered individuals. So in this period, we're seeing this theme that individuals can make changes. And that leads us to the Sisterhood of Reforms, this era of individuals seeking to make a change in society for the better, to use their power to make a difference. And we call this period the Sisterhood of Reforms because there's going to be a ton of different reform movements. There's a movement to improve nutrition and health, and a movement for finding treatment for mental illness, and a movement for education, and a movement to stop people from drinking. And all these movements exist independently of each other. They're not coordinated. There's no national organizations. They pop up in communities where people feel that there is a problem. However, a lot of the people who belong to, let's say, the movement to find treatment for mental illness might also belong to the movement to get people to stop drinking as much. So people overlapped, their morals overlapped, but the main idea of the Sisterhood of Reforms, which took place largely in cities, is that people are empowered to make change. Now, not everybody thought the existing system could be changed. There were some people that said, we can't fix these existing communities. There's too many problems. It's insurmountable. And so these individuals opted to form utopian societies. Utopian is a word that means perfect place. So they said, we're going to leave the cities. We're going to leave the corrupted communities. We're going to go out into the middle of nowhere and craft our own community, which is going to be perfect because we're going to establish new rules for that. So one of the first groups that attempted to reform society by creating a utopian society was the Shakers. And they were a religious movement that was awaiting the return of Christ. And the Bible predicted Jesus would return in the book of Revelation. And the Shakers felt like that was happening sooner rather than later. So they gathered in communities in Kentucky and Pennsylvania and New York. And everybody in the community gave up their personal property. Everything in the town, from the buildings to possessions, belonged to the community as a whole. There was no individual sense of property or ownership. The other things the Quakers practiced was celibacy, no sex between men and women, because they felt that sex was distracting from an individual's quest to find salvation. So all of the Shaker communities were sex segregated. Men slept in men's dormitories, women slept in women's dormitories. Worship services, men sat on one side of the church, women sat on the other. The same is true of dining halls. Every building had a door for men to enter and for women to enter. They wanted to keep the genders separate so that they could focus on the goal of religious salvation. Another religious group that tries to form a utopian society is the Perfectionists. And the Perfectionists emerged in upstate New York. And the Perfectionists believed that the millennium had occurred, Christ had returned, and we were now living in the world after the book of Revelation. So traditional Christian practices like marriage between two individuals, they said, had been reshaped. And the Perfectionists used what they called complex marriage. Everybody in the community of Oneida, New York, was considered married to everyone else. So they had the right to have sexual relations. Anybody could have sex with anybody else in the community because they were all married to each other. The other practice the Perfectionists did was called eugenics. It's eugenics, eugenics, and it means controlled breeding. So despite the fact that everybody was married to everybody else, nobody could have children outside of the consent of the community as a whole. They said they would tell people, you and you have a child together. And the reason they did that was they wanted to breed children based on need. So if they need people to do labor, take this burly woman and this burly man and make them have a child so that child can grow up to be a laborer. The perfectionists went as far in developing their perfect society as taking children away from parents the moment they were born, and they were raised communally by the society, not knowing which person was their parent. The third group was another religion that emerged in upstate New York, and it is called the Mormons, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is their formal name. And they were founded by a man named Joseph Smith, who believed that Christ had returned to the world in North America. He had preached to Native American people, and his writings had been written on a series of golden tablets buried in a field in upstate New York. Smith claimed to discover those tablets and found them to be a new book of the Bible. So Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, as he called it. And so a new religion was formed based on this third interpretation of Jesus's teachings for the modern world. To promote Mormonism and to grow his faith, Smith allowed the practice of polygamy within the community, which is where one man can have multiple wives. And Smith did that because he wanted to grow the number of Mormons. And one man, multiple wives means lots of children. The Mormon practice of polygamy made them unpopular in upstate New York, and eventually they fled to the west, the edge of the United States, which was Illinois. Joseph Smith was actually killed in Illinois for encouraging polygamy. So his adopted son, Brigham Young, actually took the Mormons completely out of the borders of the United States, where they established their own community in Salt Lake City in what is today Utah. But the Mormons moved out of the borders of the country because they found no place within it. Now, there were other communities that were founded for non-religious reasons. Brook Farm was one. It was a community in New England of writers and artists and literary figures. Transcendentalists often went to Brook Farm. And there they could talk philosophy and write deep thoughts and write and write and write. That was the goal of Brook Farm. New Harmony was a community in Indiana, and it was a community of scientists geologists and botanists and plant biologists all gathered in this town, and they just focused their days and nights on scientific study and deep discourse. Now, many of these utopian experiments did not last real long, and there's a number of reasons why. First was the moral outrage that was associated with these. Groups like the Perfectionists and their complex marriage and the Mormons and their polygamy didn't sit well with their Christian neighbors. And pressure and sometimes violence was used against these groups, which eventually broke them up, or in the case of the Mormons, drove them out of the country. In other cases, in communities like Brook Farm and New Harmony, there wasn't societal pressure. There was just people there that were there to write or there to study science, but nobody wanted to till the fields and grow the crops and put shingles on the roof or empty the outhouse. So those communities failed because they fell into disrepair, because there was no one willing to step up and do the hard part of maintaining the community itself. Now, at the heart of the Sisterhood of Reforms are these voluntary organizations that we would find in cities, many places. And a voluntary organization is a group of individuals that seek to make change that are outside of the government. They're not required to take part in it. They choose to join a voluntary organization, but they want to make a difference and want to make change. And because this reform movement was so closely linked with the Second Great Awakening and the market revolution, it was prime for the middle class to become involved. Remember, to be middle class, you have A, disposable income, and B, leisure time. So voluntary organizations were perfect for you. because it gave you an outlet for your extra time and you could spend your extra money in support of them. Women also were a significant part of voluntary organizations because traditionally women were restricted from the public sphere and forced into the private sphere of the home. But when they were doing moral good, it became acceptable for women, especially middle class women, to operate in the public sphere as part of this movement. They were big within the voluntary organizations, but that was still a small number of women in society overall. Now, voluntary organizations tackled a number of different social and moral issues. The one we want you to be the most familiar with is the temperance movement. It's a movement that was religiously based out of the Second Great Awakening, but it became part of a larger Sisterhood of Reform movement. And temperance sought to limit the amount of alcohol that people were consuming. Ideally, they would stop, but temperance wasn't pushing people to quit drinking, just drinking less. They felt it interfered religiously with finding salvation. Women said that they cited alcohol as a source of violence within the home. Employers didn't like it because people came to work drunk. And some people even pushed for the temperance movement, some reformers, because they didn't like the immigrants who were coming to the United States from cultures where drinking plays heavily, like the Germans and especially the Irish. So they thought if they could get those cultures either to cut back on their drinking or make it a society that was not welcoming to drinking, that would cut off the flow of undesirable immigrants into the United States. Other voluntary organizations formed. Dorothea Dix led reformers in Massachusetts to move people with mental illness out of prisons and into mental asylums for treatment. There were organizations that were trying to put a Bible in the home of every American. So a lot of crusades, public education, and to create schools was another voluntary movement that had voluntary organizations in it. So these middle class people found all kinds of different outlets under the umbrella of the Sisterhood of Reforms. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in part 2 of the Era of Reform.